Can everyone hear me pretty well? Great. My name is Chuck Radis, and I first wanted to thank you for coming out on a beautiful summer night. There's a lot of other things you could have been doing. We've had a lot of beautiful summer weather, even if it is getting a little too dry. I wanted to thank M. Lewis for inviting me here to speak at the library. And, you know, I have a special love, as probably most of you do, for libraries. You know, they play such an important cultural part in our communities. And I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you today. Before I get into the body of the talk, and I thought I'd divide this up into giving a little background with some slides, a reading from part of Island Medicine, and then take questions for as long as you feel you have questions. But I wanted to make you aware that for some of you who have published, who have purchased Island Medicine, that on the back cover, it's inaccurate. You know, it kind of gives the impression that my practice on the islands is still going on, and that I'm making 150 house calls a year on the Casco Bay Islands. And actually, my books cover a time period that was pretty limited, from 1985 to 1991. And although my wife and I still live in the same house we used to live in, after that, I got some additional training and so commuted to Portland to practice. And now I actually commute up to Ellsworth to practice. So I haven't been doing 100 house calls a year, even though I still help out from time to time on Peaks Island, where I live still, with house calls. I thought I'd do something a little different to start tonight, and that is, this goes back to some papers that a former patient of mine gave me, Margaret Randall, elderly lady. She kept the minutes from some of the island meetings over the years, dating back to the 1890s. And it was really great. She'd give them to me. And a lot of the same things that would come up as news or island business would be the same as it was 130 years ago. Peaks Island wanted to secede from Portland in 1893, and it wants to secede from Portland in 2022. So some things never change. But what I was struck by, as she would give me these copies, and this may be true up and down the coast in meetings, is that particularly in the winter, they would start, before the business, they would start with a demonstration, like someone would recite a poem, or they would sing a song, or play the flute. So to begin, we'll consider this a meeting. I was going to give you a whistling demonstration. If I can, because if I'm smiling, I can't do this. Thank you. So to put us in the right mood for talking about things that go on the coast. And I have a thing that moves this forward. And I wrote the first book, Go by Boat, a year ago that came out. And this is the second, but I just want to put in a little plug for a third book that my brothers and I put out about a month ago. And this is a updated guide to the flowering plants of Casco Bay that we did about 12 years ago. And part of the reason I'm bringing it up is that the third brother, my third brother called us the Botany Brothers, and which is a really wild group of guys, right? The Botany Brothers. But poor Steve, he passed away shortly before the book was finished, and he was a great guy. So I just wanted to commemorate his memory by putting him up here and mention the book that finally we were able to put together with his help. So as a background, I just wanted to give you a sense of how I came to practice and live on the Casco Bay Islands. My medical training eventually, after medical school, came to fruition as an internal medicine resident in Portland. And what would happen is that frequently we would get islanders coming into our emergency room or being admitted, and inevitably they were without a primary care physician, and they often came in with really late disease. If they were diabetics, it had been uncontrolled for years. If they had heart disease, they came in with heart attacks or strokes. If it was pneumonia, it was like they stayed at home until the last possible moment, and they would come in often literally at death's door. And all too frequently, not all too frequently, I mean, it was wonderful. They were very gritty, and they would just recover from almost anything. And instead of like getting a week of IV antibiotics for pneumonia, and day 3, they would have come in, needed oxygen, and almost on a ventilator, they were dressed and ready to go home. They just didn't want to stay in Portland, and some of them left against medical advice, but it was like, wow, this is really a different population of people. They don't have good primary care. And I knew I owed the federal government 3 years of service. And I went through medical school on a health manpower shortage area, public health scholarship. And I began to think, well, the islands have so little in terms of healthcare. I've got another year in my internal medicine residency. Why don't I spend that time going to islands and seeing if there's any interest for them to work toward being designated as a health manpower shortage area? So I naively, on evenings, I would take the ferry out to one of the islands after a meeting was arranged, and I'd meet with islanders about my ideas. They all had to band together, the 4 year-round islands on Casco Bay, in order to be designated. There wouldn't necessarily be money for a clinic. There wouldn't necessarily be money for me. It would be a private practice option, as the federal government called it. But I was soon finding a lot of enthusiasm, even as I learned very, very clearly that if you're on Long Island, Maine, you only talk about Long Island, Maine. You don't say anything about Peaks Island. You don't say anything about Chebeague Island or Cliff Island. And so I made a few gaffes early on. I would say, oh, what they're doing on Peaks Island, they're doing this, and Peaks Island, they're doing that. And just, I learned very quickly that even though they were all islands, and even though many of them were, doing the same work on the waterfront, there were these tensions or grudges, or sometimes things that were quite overt between the islands. So they had to kind of come together to form a health manpower shortage area, and went on Peaks Island, speak only about Peaks. So that helped me a lot after going to a few of the meetings, and it stumbled along until the point where the islands were designated, and I was chosen to be able to operate a health center on Peaks Island, operate a health center on Chebeague Island, go do house calls out on Long and Cliff. For those of you who aren't familiar with Casco Bay, if you're taking a ferry from Portland to get out to Cliff Island is roughly an hour. Peaks is only 20 minutes ferry ride, and we have ferry service where one ferry goes down the bay but doesn't stop at Peaks, stops everywhere else. And then because most of the people in the Bay live on Peaks, there's a dedicated ferry back and forth. So you can't go from Peaks to our adjacent island, Long Island. You have to go back to Portland and catch another ferry. So the whole ferry system's a little complicated, but I soon learned, and as it came to fruition, the city of Portland was happy that I was doing that because the emergency services on our islands in Casco Bay were provided by the police, EMTs, and a fireboat. And for them, it was very frequent that here they were going out to the island to bring in somebody with pneumonia who was almost on a ventilator. And it was like the idea of someone seeing someone early and treating pneumonia was very attractive. So the police got involved. They would bring me out to some of the outer islands for house calls on my house call routes. Now, probably, for those of you who have visited Peaks Island, and how many of you have visited Peaks? At least a third, half of you or more. Peaks in the mid 1980s was a very different place than it is now. It was economically the poorest neighborhood in Portland, tied with Munjoy Hill. Both of those neighborhoods were very poor. In fact, Peaks had the nickname of Welfare Island. And during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you applied for city assistance, the rents were very, very cheap on Peaks. And the advice to people when they would get some assistance from the city, well, move out to Peaks Island. You can live there very inexpensively. So we had a lot of multi-generational poverty, particularly up the dirt roads in the interior of Peaks and Long, maybe a little less in Chebeague Island, which always, I think, was a little more affluent. And so the reason why the islands became designated by the federal government was because these were poor islands without access to medical care. Even though you could see Mercy Hospital or Maine Med in the distance in the Bay, it was, if you had an emergency on Long Island and you called 911, it's about an hour and 25 minutes before you'd hit the emergency room. So it's quite rural. So, and this is a picture of my wife, Sandi, and our one-year-old daughter, Kate, when we moved out to Peaks Island. Vehicles did not have to be inspected, and that is still true on Peaks. A special dispensation by the state legislature allowed us to have cars that could still run. And this was our first vehicle on the island that someone gave it to us for free. On the far side was our house when we first bought it. And you literally couldn't see it from the road almost, even though this is on the water, and from the beach. The bittersweet and the knotweed and the aspens and everything were so high. You couldn't see the house from the beach. You couldn't see the house from the road almost. And so we lived in that for 9 months because it wasn't insulated, and then moved out on the island while we got it redone to get insulated. And eventually it was never right. We had frozen pipes. We still have frozen pipes. Yeah. My wife's father, when I told him that we like his opinion about this house on Peaks Island, he comes out, and little did he know that we'd already bought it. I'd already shook hands on it, and he looks at it and he says, "What do I think?" Takes out a match. He goes, "This is what I think." But eventually, this is where we still live, and we've gone through a number of vehicles over the years. One vehicle in the winter was in this exact same spot and rear-ended it about 2 o'clock in the morning so hard that it was launched across the road into a snowdrift. Like literally, I couldn't see it. We heard kind of this explosive crash in the middle of the night. I get out and I go, where's the truck? And it's like way over. So we've had lots of vehicles. No one has garages on Peaks. I think maybe now the first garage is occurring. So even though Peaks has changed tremendously, and the other islands as well, this is kind of the world I stepped into when I began practicing out there in 1985. And sometimes folks ask, well, a lot of this happened in 85, 91. Did you have a diary at home? But my process of writing, which I was already doing in college and wanted to write stories, was always keeping track of conversations, was to write them down in that retro pocket planner. The nerds, have them up here with a slide rule. And so I kind of was going through my old stuff just recently and realized I have almost every yearly pocket planner and they're just full of quotes. And I didn't use it as a diary. It wasn't like I woke up today, it was warm, I'm not feeling so great, it was a hard night. It was always about interesting conversations that hopefully would trigger a memory. And they do. I can go back through some of these older ones still and read a quote of something kind of clever that somebody said, and that'll bring me back, to that. I may be extraordinarily forgetful in real life, but I kind of have a knack for remembering stories if I have a little bit of a conversation that I've put down. As an example, so, and this is kind of a sad thing with the narcotic epidemic and just, all the ravages we've had in our society with narcotics, but, it's still, it's like, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and prescribing low doses of narcotics when there's no other options, is still done. And so I had a very elderly woman who had end stage arthritis in her knees, but she had so many medical problems and she was on a walker. She couldn't get her knees replaced and it was just agony. And so I said, well, why don't we just try just a half of oxycodone twice a day and see if that helps? And I said, be careful about balance. Don't take it if you don't feel right. But she comes back, she's just beaming when she comes back about a week later. She says, oh, Dr. Radis, that oxy condom, that protects me from pain. And I go, okay, oxycontin protects me from it. I got to write that down, so into the bucket it went. So I would hear and I go, oh, yeah, that's really pretty amazing. So I would write down those kinds of quotes. What I thought I'd read a little bit here, but if there's any questions you have now about kind of the lead up to this, or if you want to save your questions till after I do a bit of reading, that'd be. Yeah, well, I was born in Henderson, Nevada. I was the youngest of the three brothers. My dad was out there shortly after the war, and we moved to New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and okay, somebody's going to say, which exit did you grow up on, right? But the community I lived in had a trout stream going through it. There was a rib in a park. I grew up really in the woods of the wilderness of New Jersey. So it was, I was outdoors all the time, but I spent my time. And then I came up to Maine to go to Bates College and stayed on, so. Yesterday, I spotted the season's first iridescent blue and gold crocus poking through a patch of snow on my walk to clinic. Today, there were 6 in a small clump, with the flowers leaning toward the sun. Within a few days, a week at most, the petals would wilt and drop, and if the warming trend held, other spring flowers would pick up the beat: daffodils, coltsfoot, blue violets, wild geranium. But my favorite there we go. Anyone recognize this particular flower? My favorite was gold thread. It's the most difficult to spy before the ethereal half-inch white flowers disappeared. It's a ground-hugging resident of the island's spruce understory. And it's not just the flower alone that delights me. Just beneath the surface is a thread-like orange rhizome. the source of a bitter herbal remedy for cold sores and intestinal parasites. And though the islands have been settled and farmed for hundreds of years, with the interior meadows reclaimed by red spruce and white pine, gold thread was back. More likely, it never left. And as an aside, one of our early female botanists in America named this, the Latin name for this flower, but about a year later, and that's kind of considered for someone who discovers something, they get to name the flower, but she was overridden. So another botanist got to name it, but she was originally in the naming of it. So it's kind of has this connection to her many, many years ago. This is what our health center looked like when I first arrived, and that is me. Here's a brochure from the early years at the Island Health Center. It was a year-round home. A family had a tragedy, and they really wanted to donate the house because they just couldn't live on the island anymore. And that became our Island Health Center for about 25 years. I continue on the board at our health center. We now have a new building in the center of the island, but for about 20 years, this was our health center. I arrived at the health center a few minutes early, setting my green satchel and day pack on my desk. Catching her breath, she seemed to relax. I like daffodils. Me too, I replied. They really brighten up the hair. I dangled the stethoscope in her direction and asked, "Do you mind? May I take a listen to your lungs?" In response, she half turned and I placed the stethoscope against her posterior chest wall. Moist crackles extended from the right mid-lung field up toward the shoulder. It's definitely more than a cold. You have pneumonia. Well, I knew that. Well, I'm just saying, I agree with you. I need to pee. She lurched to her feet and sat heavily onto a bedside commode at the foot of the bed. The effort left her winded. I pressed my case. Now, I'd like to have officers Mike and John come inside and help you onto a stretcher so that we can get you to town on the fireboat. You'll feel better if we give you some oxygen. There was another long pause. Officer John, Ruth finally replied. He's very nice. He brought my dog Lisa home when she ran away. For the first time, I was aware that the mop of golden hair curled up beside her pillow was a small dog. I scratched Lisa behind an ear, then cracked open the door and waved in the general direction of a flowering forsythia, where I knew Mike and Big John were hiding. Meeting them at the door, I explained that nothing personal, but it might be better if only John came in with a stretcher. John, Big John, as we called him, was about 6'9", ducked under the doorway, pulling the stretcher behind him. Hey, it's Lisa. He reached out a giant, beefy hand and patted the dog lightly on the head. We'll take good care of her while you're gone. You're a tall one, aren't you? Ruth said. Yes, people have noticed that, John answered. Here, up you go. We're going to take a little ride. You'll be home before you know it. As a follow-up, quick follow-up, in the next chapter, for those of you who may have read the book, I get a phone call on another island, and she got on the fireboat. She got to the emergency room. She had a chest x-ray. She had an IV started. She got a dose of IV antibiotics, and then refused to be admitted, refused to get off the stretcher. They brought her back on the ambulance, put her back on the fireboat. They brought her home. So this is kind of, just how stressful for both patients and myself would be, because then for days after that I was seeing her at home, hoping that she would pull through with her pneumonia in a situation where the standard of care would be IV antibiotics. But she was very resilient, and she lived for many, many years after that on the island. As an aside, sometimes people wonder, who are these people on the islands? And I did almost always combine patients sometimes change their sex. In many cases, because it's a small island, people, I think, still recognize who some of these stories are about. But in general, I've often been surprised that people like being written about. A couple of the characters in my first book, Bud Perry and a patient from Cliff Island, Johanna von Tilling, everybody knew more about their medical history than I did. You know, they were just kind of constantly talking about things. So the patient-physician kind of privileged conversation with some patients in the book was not as tight as it is in some communities. So with that, I'd be glad to take some questions either now or afterwards. I do have some copies of the book, or I'd be glad to sign a book or two with you. Any thoughts or questions you might have? Yeah, hi.
I don't actually have a question, but I have this is a story to tell. So what brought us here tonight is you actually treated my daughter Jordan 22 years ago.
Well, hi,
So,
Jordan.
Jordan, her father passed away when she was 7 years old. Not emotional, but we had to travel to Tufts because Jordan ended up having the same blood disorder that her father passed away from. Tufts was a hard ride for us. Every 6 months or 3 months, we were referred to you by a girl that I worked with, and you captured her, the ugliest patient that you could ever have, because she was miserable. She hated coming to doctors for good reason, because every time she had to come, she had to have lab work, and she was 7 years old.
Yeah.
I think it was possibly our second visit, maybe, because the first visit was just more talk. You brought her into your office versus your exam room. You gave her a doll. I don't know if you recall that.
Wow, I don't remember the doll.
Okay.
I do remember you, Jordan. Hi. Yeah.
But you gave her the doll to kind of relax and set her at ease and have an understanding of playfulness and make the appointments joyful versus difficult. Jordan can tell you more stories that she recalls about the glove balloons
Oh my
and
gosh.
the drawings that you used to do on the glove balloons. And then at one point, because we continued to see you every 3 months for a significant amount of time, and then we went to 6 months, but as we got to know each other, you became interested in the fishing industry because my now husband that I've been with for 22 years is a fisherman. And so we talked about his lobstering and at the time shrimp, he did the shrimping and scalloping and all of those types of things. So we joined the meeting tonight just because the reconnect of your keeping Jordan healthy and well.
Wow.
So, just to share a true life real story, and we're not from the island or anything of that nature, but we traveled 2 hours one way to come to your rheumatology associates in Portland at the time.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
After I finished my stint of primary care, I did morph into rheumatology and clinical immunology, which I still do. Had been at Rheumatology Associates until about 5 years ago, and now I come up to Ellsworth for a week at a time, one week a month. Stay up there and see patients in Maine Coast Memorial Hospital. So glad you did well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other comments or questions? Or yeah.
I do want this story. On the island, how mobile are the people that live on the island? Do they stick pretty close to home? Say, for instance, I'm staying at St. Peaks, back when we first got there. Do they stay pretty much to home? They work as fishermen and probably woodsmen. But the isolation and the loneliness, wouldn't that attribute to a mental? I mean, the COVID for 2 years is certainly.
Yeah,
affected
you
lots
can
of
see how
us
that's dragged
with
us
the
down.
isolation.
Yeah,
Would you-
it varied a little bit island to island. Even Peaks, though, which was a commuter island because it was so close. A lot of people would be on the 6:15 or 7:15 ferry into Portland and walk to work. Even on Peaks, though, I had this whole background group of people who never left the island. And it was remarkable, the number of very elderly patients, 90, 95, 100, who lived independently on the island. And, you know, they often had support from family or neighbors. On Peaks, by the time I moved out there in 1985, was down to one grocery store. But even though the population really hadn't changed much, only about 15 years before that, there had been 5 neighborhood stores, which was true about most of the islands, where people would have a little neighborhood on Peaks. Peaks is 4 miles around. And I would meet people who would be happy to see somebody in the waiting room says, "Oh, Lily, you know, I haven't seen you in years. You know, I don't get over to this side of the island very often," kind of thing. So even on Peaks, there was a lot of that. But on the other islands, I think even a little more. I don't know if mental health problems were less or more frequent than other places, but I do know that probably the percentage of people who didn't have, you know, access to mental health services was high. Yeah.
Happy to have you. First in 1985.
Yeah, I went through each of the islands, like had a health organization. They were trying to boot up to try to attract some additional medical care, and Peaks Island was the one that had a part-time clinic already, but then had lost their provider. Mainland had started about 5 years before that in that house, a part-time family practice program, but then that petered out. And so they were used to having somebody out. And so the fact that I was coming out there was very, very much appreciated. Although I would say I'm a DO, so I'm a doctor of osteopathic medicine. And so in those days, there was still a segment of the population that would like, I would never go to an osteopathic physician. And so from time to time, I'd get a little blowback about that. And, you know, there would be times when that was really uncomfortable. But that was a rarity, but, you know, I knew that that was a little bit in the background. I never felt, you know, like some of the, you know, these TV shows that are takeoffs on doctors in rural areas, you know, they come out and they're naive about all this stuff and everything, and they kind of sputter around and everything. I don't know. I just settled into an island practice naively, thinking that it would be a little easier, but ultimately I always felt I didn't suffer from a lack of confidence. You know, I felt like I had good training, and I knew I was going to be doing the islands, and so I got some training that internal medicine people don't usually get. I got pediatrics before, you know, to be able to take care of young kids, and I did some gynecology rotation. And so the one thing I refused to have anything to do with were home births. And the reason for that is that the year before we moved out to Peaks Island, there was a home birth and the baby died. And so it's one of those situations where everything's great in most births, but when things go south, if you're an hour and 10 minutes from an emergency room, you're cooked. And so there are some things you really can't temporize with a bad delivery or vaginal bleeding post-op, so post-delivery. So I had interactions with women who were pregnant. I would follow them along, but I just was tried to be very, very clear that I was not going to try to. No, no one was delivering babies on the island. I think there was, it really scared people off. You know, this was a normal, healthy pregnancy, and at that point, when things happened, it just happened, and the baby died, and would have survived in a hospital setting. You know. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, if not, I'd be glad to hang around for a little bit and thank you very much for coming. And thank you for making the effort to come up. And Jordan, I'm glad you're doing well. I hope everything's pretty level. Ship shape, great. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.